Hello and welcome to Political Thinking. My guest this week is currently the most popular politician in France, which means that Jordan Bardella, who's just 30 years old, is favourite to be elected as his country's next president in just 18 months' time. He and his National Rally Party have risen in the polls as President Macron has become ever more unpopular. French politics has become ever more turbulent, with 5 prime ministers in the past 2 years, and as Monsieur Bardella has sought to cast aside his party's extremist past. Originally called the National Front, its founder was Jean-Marie Le Pen, a convicted Holocaust-denier. Le Pen's daughter, Marine Le Pen, should have been the party's presidential candidate, but she's currently unable to run because of a conviction for embezzling EU funds, although she is appealing against that conviction. For now, what they call in France Plan B, Plan Bardella, is gaining momentum as my guest tours France, woos business leaders, talks to the foreign media as he seeks to convince those who once shunned him and his party that his message, France for the French, anti-immigrant and anti-EU, are now mainstream and not the views of a far-right extremist. Jordan Bardella, welcome to Political Thinking.
Bonjour et merci pour votre invitation.
I should explain that we are conducting this interview with translation. This has been a big week for you. President Trump has issued a new national security strategy in which he says he's supporting patriotic parties. Do you think he means you?
Écoutez, je crois qu'il y a un vent de liberté, de fierté nationale qui est...
Listen, I believe there is a wind of freedom and national pride blowing across all major Western democracies. And it is true that President Trump in the United States was an expression of that current stream of ideas, of that great popular movement. And he managed, I think, by appealing to American pride and the ambition to make the United States a great power again, greater than it already is, around the concept of America first, to reconcile the working class, the American middle class, and part of the entrepreneurial elite. And he has done this, I believe, with a certain degree of success. Now, Trump defends his country's interests. I respect leaders who defend their country's interests. What I criticize French leaders for, and European leaders more broadly, is for not defending their country's interest strongly enough. It is true that Trump was giving a nod to patriotic parties around the world, and I welcome that with a certain goodwill. But as for me, I wish to defend the interest of my country tomorrow. I do not like this vassalization of Europe towards any great power. Ultimately, my project is both the greatness, the freedom and the independence of France and of Europe.
Do you agree with the language that is used in this strategy document by the United States? It says there's a very real prospect of civilizational erasure. It warns that European countries could become majority non-European. Is that your view?
Oui, en grande partie, je partage.
Yes, to a large extent, I share that assessment. First of all, I am pleased that France and Europe, far beyond their borders, are capable of speaking to the hearts and consciences of people around the world. You know what struck me? It was during one of the most dramatic events our country has experienced in the past decade. The fire at Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris. This tragedy moved people and consciences all over the world. And I believe that France is truly itself when it can speak in its universal vocation to all hearts and all minds across the globe. I believe that it is the beauty of our civilization. It is true that mass immigration and the laxity of our leaders over the past 30 years regarding migration policies are today disrupting the power balance of European societies, Western societies, and particularly the French society. I grew up in a region, we may talk about it later, called Seine-Saint-Denis, an area that receives a very large amount of immigration, particularly from Africa and North Africa. And of course, when you open the floodgates of immigration, then you bring in people. And through family reunification, you bring in even more people who also come with their culture, their language, their customs, and their way of life. Look, I do not see France as a country that must be closed. But I believe that we must control our immigration. And I believe that tomorrow and the day after, France should no longer be a country of mass immigration. Of course, we must be able to welcome people who come to work, to contribute to our national story and to the country's economic wealth. But it is true that we can no longer be the most lax country in Europe. And if tomorrow I am leading my country with my political movement, I will ensure that France regains control of its immigration policies and that we put an end to 30 years of laxity in this area.
There are politicians all over Europe who could say what you say, but you go much further. You talk about the European people disappearing. You talk about French people being submerged by migrants. Now, in a second, we talk maybe about the detail of policy. But let's focus on what you're doing here. You've been a busy man. You've been to Israel to visit the Holocaust Museum. You've been wooing French business leaders. You've been meeting with The Economist magazine. You're now here at the BBC. Your job is this, isn't it? You're trying to say to people, we're not extremists anymore. We're not racists anymore.
Yes, it is in any case about fighting against the caricatures made of my political movement, of my ideas, of its members, activists and parliamentarians. I lead a political party, the National Rally, thanks to the trust given to me by Marine Le Pen. And it is today the leading political party in France. We have the largest group of MPs in the National Assembly. I personally chair the third largest group in the European Parliament, which is the main opposition party within the European Parliament in Strasbourg and Brussels. And today, in every poll and every voting intention published in France, we are the party predicted to win the next legislative elections and the next presidential election. So my responsibility is obviously to bring the French people together and to present the country with a project of national recovery. Because my country, France, is in an economic, social, financial, budgetary and security situation that is extremely difficult. And this means that expectations for change and disruption are extremely high among my people, among the French people. I want to save my country, but I also want France, internationally and around us, to reconnect with its vocation as a civilization nation, that is, a country capable of defending its interest on the European stage while also being able to work with European partners. And so it is natural that I should also, when meeting the foreign press or business leaders who operate abroad, come to present the project I am carrying for my country. I am aware that France has a special role in Europe. And for many European peoples, if France shifts direction, many European countries will find in our country a hope for radically changing how the European Union functions.
You call it a cliché about your party. It's a fact. Your party was a racist party. It is the history of the National Rally. After it stopped being the National Front. You know, although you're a young man, you only met him briefly, Jean-Marie Le Pen described the gas chambers used by the Nazis to murder millions of Jews in this continent as a footnote in history. To be taken seriously, do you not need to say to people, we were a racist party, we need to change?
I reject these accusations because there has never been, in the DNA or in the proposal of the National Front, now the National Rally, any statements or proposals intending to harm or offend groups of people in my country. However, it is true that there were remarks, notably made by Jean-Marie Le Pen, which eventually caused a political rupture between Jean-Marie Le Pen, the party's founder, and Marine Le Pen, then its president. On the key issue of fighting anti-Semitism, she judged that Jean-Marie Le Pen's ambiguities and verbal provocations were dragging the entire political movement into an unacceptable situation. And so, in 2015, Marine Le Pen, as I remind you, took the responsibility, an extremely difficult personal decision, of expelling her own father from the National Front. I committed myself to Marine Le Pen. I am now president of the National Rally, which is not a National Front.
This series, Political Thinking, we explore why politicians believe the things that they believe. And what is interesting about you, as you talk of France for the French, is that your parents were not French. One parent, your mother, was born in Italy. Your father was born to an Algerian mother and an Italian father. As the son of immigrants, why is it that you are stirring up anger with immigrants?
I am indeed a product of immigration. My parents, in particular my mother and her side of the family, came from Italy in the 1960s. And I belong to a generation of people from immigrant backgrounds who, when they arrived in France, did everything they could to become French, not partially but fully, to embrace the national story, the language, the culture, the heritage, to blend into the national community, and ultimately to become French in both heart and mind. There are many people in our country, in France, which is, the country I know best, who made this demanding effort when coming from abroad, from elsewhere, to become completely from here and to become French. And we must never forget the extremely demanding efforts made by entire generations of people from immigrant backgrounds. But it is also true that today many people arrive in our country and seem exempt from this effort. In many parts of France, we see people who are unquestionably from here, born in France, raised in French schools, but who, through the messages they share on social media, in the streets, through the way they challenge our history or sometimes reject Republican institutions such as the police or values like secularism, clearly have their hearts elsewhere. And for me, it is this difference, this injustice, that fundamentally troubles me. So I believe that in a country with 5 million unemployed people, endemic poverty, and major budgetary difficulties, France cannot welcome 500,000 people every year.
Who exactly is French? Because you now say it is not good enough to be born in France. Even if you are born in France, Jordan Bardella says you are not French. So who is French?
Les Français, ceux qui ont eu le cœur qui saigne en regardant.
The French are those whose heart bled the day Notre Dame burned. I believe that being French, obviously, there are administrative considerations, but to me, being French is firstly an honor. And I believe that being French goes well beyond the administration.
Forgive me, this is emotion. Of course, you have to support the French football team. You have to cry when Notre Dame burns. That is not an answer for someone who wants to be president. The law is what matters. Who is French? When we look ahead to the World Cup, is Dembele French? He's Muslim. Is Kante French? He's Muslim. Was Zinedine Zidane French? Benzema? Were these people French? Or are they not French because they embrace a different culture, an Islamic culture?
Oui, mais
Yes, but I hear your question. Again, I do not judge people's hearts or souls. And I consider as French all those who themselves feel they belong to the great French nation and the national community. But it is true that sometimes it pains me a little, not just as a supporter, but also as a French citizen and as a patriot, to see certain football players refusing to sing La Marseillaise, to refuse to sing the national anthem. Because once again, being French also means adhering to values, adhering to ways of life. It also means recognizing equality between men and women. And it is true that today, in a number of French areas and suburbs, banlieue as we say, another culture is taking root, seeing relations between men and women differently, sometimes asking little girls aged 5 or 6 to wear an Islamic veil, sometimes demanding separate hours at the swimming pool. Of course, all of this is a problem for me. So yes, I am a defender of secularism. And I believe that today, Islamism has become a fully fledged political project, one that does not seek to live separately from French society, but rather to impose all its prohibitions upon it.
You grew up in an area where you said pretty much everyone was an immigrant. You taught immigrants. You actually went to a class to be their teacher. What changed in Jordan Bardella that meant the people you were one day teaching, you were then saying to the rest of France, are destroying our culture, are destroying our country?
Well, it is precisely because I grew up in an area that experienced all the consequences of a massive, anarchic, disorderly immigration policy and a constant undermining of the Republican order. Today, the areas that have received the highest levels of immigration are also the most crime-prone territories in France. These are facts. This model of a multicultural society is by nature multi-conflictual. And if I got involved in politics, it was to prevent my entire country, the France I love and do not want to see disappear, from looking like the neighborhood where I grew up, which is now plagued by insecurity, drug trafficking, and Islamist fundamentalism. It is important to understand that France has a very different model from the Anglo-Saxon model. The Anglo-Saxon model is based on integration, meaning that when you arrive in a country, you come with your luggage, your language, your culture, your customs. France has a republican tradition that I defend, called Republican assimilation. Republican assimilation means do not come as you are, become what we are. And I ask nothing more from people arriving in our country than to resemble us, to live in the French way, and to respect the effort made by previous generations of immigrants, including my own. Even if one can argue that European immigrants assimilate more easily, especially from Italy, since Italy and France are naturally sister nations, I want this effort of assimilation to be put back on the table. So, if tomorrow I am at the head of the government, it will no longer be possible, for example, to benefit from jus soli. Today, the almost automatic acquisition of French nationality means that if you are born on French soil, by the age of 18 you are almost automatically recognized as French. This jus soli does not exist, for example, in Italy, nor in many other European countries. So we will obviously restrict the possibility of obtaining French nationality. You may ask what has made me evolve on this issue. I want to make it clear. I have nothing against individuals. I can question immigration policy without scapegoating or pointing fingers at people. When France is socially generous, politically welcoming, and offers opportunities, it is natural that people from the other side of the Mediterranean, for example, are tempted to come here. What I will tell them tomorrow is, do not come to our country anymore, because we no longer have the means to accommodate such high level of immigration. Today, we are the most lenient country in Europe on immigration. I want tomorrow for us to tighten the conditions for entering French territory and to become one of the countries where migration is, perhaps, the most strictly regulated administratively, legally, and politically.
I look at my watch and I realise you have to go for lunch with Nigel Farage.
We are late.
Mr. Farage and you are meeting. He was quite rude about the National Rally a few years ago.
C'est vrai.
Has he changed his mind? Do you see yourself as allies? Do you hope that one day France will be led by Jordan Bardella and the United Kingdom will be led by Nigel Farage? Is that the dream?
I think the wind of freedom and patriotism is blowing across all major Western democracies. Britain is a great country. It has been a historic, geographic and political partner of France for many years, and whatever happens, cooperation between our two countries must obviously continue. I came here, it is true, to meet Nigel Farage in particular, who may have been harsh in the past towards my political movement. But that's politics. You're allowed to evolve. My political party has also evolved, even in its name, since it is now called a National Rally. And I believe, yes, I think, that Nigel Farage will be the next Prime Minister of the United Kingdom for a very simple reason. He is an extremely resilient man. I believe he has fought all his life sincerely to defend the interest of his country, the interest of his people, to bring a singular, free, independent voice onto the international stage, especially within European institutions. And I think that this attachment that he has to his own people, this desire to defend work, defend security, and fight against mass immigration, corresponds, according to the polls, to the expectations of many of your fellow citizens. So I wish him the best, and I hope for your country that he will be Prime Minister one day.
So I ask you some questions about what you might do if you're president, and maybe Nigel Farage is Prime Minister. Would you help to stop the boats coming across the Channel? Do you think it is right for many British people to think France does not do enough to stop the boats?
If tomorrow I were leading the government in France, as I've said, France will no longer be a country of mass immigration. And by introducing measures aimed at drastically reducing immigration into France, this would automatically have consequences on the departures of migrants from Calais in northern France towards Britain. Because I believe that part of the problem cannot be solved solely between France and England. And the issue with the British Prime Minister, just like with Mr. Macron, is that they think we need to deal with the consequences rather than the causes. But I believe that the real border that would allow the UK to reduce the number of people attempting the crossing from Calais is actually in Italy, at Lampedusa, or between Greece and Turkey, which means that if we were in power, we would renegotiate all the agreements related to migration. With the referendum that we will implement, we will regain control of our borders. And by limiting entry into French territory, we will automatically limit the flow of migrants to Calais and therefore the number of people attempting to reach British shores. Now, I also believe in police cooperation between the UK and France on the question of immigration. Not so that we bring people back to the French coast, but to return them to their countries of origin.
To be clear for our British listeners and viewers, you would need a referendum to change the law on immigration policy in the way you do, not simply to win an election. Let me ask you about another big policy, the war in Ukraine. Now, your party wants to be trusted, and yet you've traditionally been quite close to Russia. Marine Le Pen took money from Russia for her presidential campaign. If you were in the talks now about ending the war, would you still insist there can be no French troops on Ukrainian soil? There can be no weapons given to Ukraine to attack Russia? There can be no EU membership for Ukraine? And wouldn't that be a victory for Vladimir Putin?
Well, I consider that Russia today represents a multidimensional threat to French and European interest. We see this in particular in Africa, in our historical zones of influence, where France's influence has declined in recent years under the political and military pressures of the Wagner militias. We see it in our overseas territories, where Russia systematically sides with foreign countries that claim sovereignty over French territories located overseas. And we see it regularly when French military personnel are targeted by the Russian Federation. And as you mentioned, we have seen it over the past 3 years at the gates of Europe. Now, I would just like, if you allow me, to clarify one point. When my political party, and you mentioned Marine Le Pen, more than a decade ago, was forced to
From a Russian bank.
A Czech Russian bank, I remind you that no French bank, no European bank at the time had agreed to lend to the National Front. And we found this Czech-Russian bank that made a loan at, I believe, 6%. You will agree that this was not a friendly loan, with a bank that has since gone bankrupt. I believe that when you are tied to the Kremlin, by definition, you do not go bankrupt in Russia. My first decision as president of the National Rally was to immediately repay this loan. So we are beholden to nothing, neither money nor political interest. I have condemned, and we as a party have condemned, without any ambiguity, Russia's aggression against Ukraine. Today, we must bring Western countries to the table. This process has largely begun in recent months to establish conditions that allow Ukraine to implement a ceasefire, but above all, to secure the guarantees for its safety. Because that is the real issue. And once again, Russia is a multi-dimensional threat. I believe we must be extremely cautious, and I am firmly opposed to sending troops to Ukraine, because I consider that it would contribute to an escalation, especially given that we have nuclear weapons and that President Putin has intentions whose limits no one can know.
Monsieur Bardella, I hesitate to end our interview by pointing out that I'm double your age. You're just 30. You dropped out of university. The only job you had outside politics was with your father's firm. Do you really think you're qualified to run a country with nuclear weapons, which is on the UN Security Council, which is one of the largest economies in Europe?
First of all, it is up to the French people to decide and choose whether they consider us credible and close to their concerns. If I believe the results of the last election, and certainly the results of polls conducted by your colleagues in France, a majority, at least potentially, of French citizens grant us both legitimacy and the ability to address the country's problems. So I prepare every day, I work every day, and I strive to listen to my fellow citizens. It is true that I am 30 years old. Unfortunately, there is nothing I can do about that. If all goes well, I will be 35 in 5 years and 40 in 10 years. It is also true that I'm not one of these leaders who's been coasting away for 30 or 40 years in French political life. But the environment in which I grew up made me aware very early and at a young age of a number of urgent issues which today remain the existential urgencies of my country. And I fight for them. And I prefer that people tell me today that it is too early rather than come and tell me tomorrow that it is too late.
A final question, if I may. It is often said of you that you are charming, that you're charismatic. I can confirm that. You have 2 million followers on TikTok, you have a new book, you have a lot of supporters. But there are people who say, look, the smiles, the selfies, the slick social media videos, the smart suits, they're just a rebranding exercise for an extreme party. Was extreme, still extreme. What do you say to them?
Mais enfin franchement,
Let's be honest here. Do you really think that it would be enough for us to be the likely winner of a presidential election in a country of 70 million people? Let me tell you, in any case for observers, whatever I say or do, I will always be wrong. There will always be something to criticize me for, from my political opponents, my adversary or the observers. So I work calmly, I move forward, trying to stay as far as possible from the criticism. And I try, with my convictions, my background and my sincerity, to convince the French that our worst enemy is time. What can still be done for France may no longer be possible in 5 to 10 years, given the dramatic deterioration of France's economic, financial, budgetary and security situation. But that's the reality. Being on the front lines in politics today exposes you to criticism, but I'm not losing sleep over it.
ça ne m'empêche pas de dormir.
Jordan Bardella, President of the National Rally in France. Thank you very much for joining me on
Thank you
Political
very
Thinking.
much. It was an honor. Thank you very much.
Thank you.